Hi, Gene Monterastelli here, the editor of tappingqandA.com. The video that you are about to watch is a conversation that was a part of this year's 24 Hours of Tapping. The 24 Hours of Tapping is a fundraiser for the amazing work that is done by the Peaceful Heart Network. The Peaceful Heart Network has brought tapping to migrants, refugees, prisoners, and the underprivileged in over 30 countries all over the world. As you watch this video, if you learned something, if you were touched by it, if you were inspired by it, the easiest way to say thank you is to support the work of the Peaceful Heart Network. To do that, all you need to do is go to 24hoursoftapping.com/support. And as you look in the description and the first comment down below, you will see a direct link to that. I hope you enjoy this conversation. I would like to share with you my friend, Dr. Dawson Church. Dawson is an award-winning science writer with 3 best-selling books to his credit. The Genie in Your Genes was his first book to demonstrate that emotions drive gene expression. Mind to Matter shows that the brain creates a match to what we think as object reality, and Bliss Brain demonstrates that peak mental states rapidly remodel the brain for happiness. Please welcome to the 24 Hours of Tapping, my friend, Dr. Dawson Church. Hi, Dawson.
Gene, it is so good to be here with you. It's a privilege. And, just seeing those images from Ulf and Gunnar's work, incredibly touching. I was tapping, I was actually shedding tears. It was just so beautiful. And thinking about those lives that are changed, imagine if those people didn't have tapping. Imagine if you and me didn't have tapping, how our
Absolutely.
lives would have taken a very different path. So it's a privilege to be here. It's a privilege to be part of this amazing global work.
And I think like what you've just said there dovetails perfectly into the conversation I want to have with you today about the way that we can use tools not just to change, do a little emotional first aid, which is really powerful, but transform what's going on. And over the course of this, I'm going to have folks define the terms they use a lot just so that we are on the same page. Not that we have to agree with the definitions, but when you're using a word, I want to know what you're saying. And resilience is one of those words that in some ways has kind of become a buzzy pop psychology word because it's something that is very, very powerful. So when you're using the word resilience or you're using the word resilient, where are you coming from or what are you thinking about when you say that?
Just think of the people you know who, when they hit a crisis, they collapse. I remember one woman, I was in a social circle when the Supreme Court struck down Roe v. Wade. And this woman was crying. She said, "I'm destroyed by this decision." So that's somebody who doesn't have a lot of inner emotional resilience. Am I are, millions of people incredibly disappointed by that decision? Absolutely. But our core is strong. That's resilience. That's psychological resilience. That's emotional resilience. That's spiritual resilience. And the way this looks in the brain is really interesting. In Actually, I'm about to geek out here too much. I'll keep it really simple.
Geek out, geek out. You're amongst your friends, Dawson. We want the good stuff.
This was an epigenetic study of male twins, one of whom served in Vietnam and one of whom didn't. So they had identical genes at birth. They had very, very similar upbringing to each other. One went to Vietnam, one did not. What their brains looked like when they came back was that the stress response circuits of those that had been to Vietnam were highly active. They were highly responsive to stress. They made cortisol just like that. Epigenetically, they were turning on the stress gene, CYP17, very, very, very quickly, the cortisol making gene. And those that hadn't been to Vietnam had normal stress responses. They were resilient in a way in which those who'd been to Vietnam no longer were. Their emotional defenses had been overwhelmed by the horrors they had seen and witnessed there. And the group that had the twins that had remained back in the mainland had not had that experience. And so their brains were functioning differently. Their networks in the hippocampus that store those abilities to either respond really in an overreactive way, like the woman who said, "I'm destroyed by the striking down of Roe v. Wade." Those people who are so predisposed to stress, that is that emotional state where you're being influenced by whatever is happening around you. Resilient people have the the nervous system. They have the nerve fibers in the hippocampus and the amygdala, in the hypothalamus and thalamus, all of these brain regions, so that when adversity hits, they may feel bad about it and they may feel deep regret, and they still have this strong inner core. So it's both a neurological and an emotional ability we have.
And so, with that being said, I guess the questions then become, we can kind of take them in order. What are the things that happen to us that reduce whatever level of resilience is? And then we can have a conversation about how we build that up. Like you gave a very clear example of, something big and traumatic, like being caught in a sense of a war-torn place, but not everybody is having those particular experiences. So just in the run-of-the-mill life, what are the things that undermine that sense or create that biochemical change? Because it's more than, like you're saying, than just a disposition. It's actually something that's inside of us. Like, what are the things that create the diminishment of that?
It begins in the womb. And a recent study found that it's passed along in males as well as in females. We've known for about 15, 20 years, studies showing that it's passed along epigenetically in the female line, both in mammals like rats and mice, and also in human beings. But what's really interesting is newer studies showing that stressed fathers pass along epigenetic tags in their sperm, and the offspring of those fathers is more prone to a stress response. So we actually start to become less resilient and more prone to being affected by stress in the womb. And if our mothers were stressed, our fathers were stressed, we can be having these stress responses built into us. We're learning them chemically in the womb. And so many of us had parents who were stressed. Many of us had grandparents who went through the Great Depression, or maybe great grandparents. We may have had parents who went through, or grandparents who went through World War II. We certainly will probably have had great grandparents who went through some war or another. So we have all of these stressed people in our backgrounds, and we know now that those molecules are passed out epigenetically through the generations. And so most of us are carrying an ancestral load of stress already, which is lowering our resilience in the womb. That's terrible news, Gene, I know. So what chance do we have? We pop out of the womb and here we're babies, and then we have more stressors.
But in addition to that being a hard thing, I think the other thing, though, it also does is, one of the things that I love about the transformational community is our ability to take responsibility. We want to take responsibility for our choices. We want to take responsibility for the way that we respond. And sometimes we're also really, really good at overtaking responsibility. And I take on too much responsibility for what's going on, and not to let us off the hook, but to recognize the fact that, like, we're not actually showing up in this place a complete blank slate where we are transforming this. We are showing up carrying all of this experience. Man, I love Mark Wolyn's book, It Didn't Start With You. Like, we're able to see the ways that it integrates into us. And so, yes, it is frustrating and disappointing that that is the case. But I also think it's a really good thing, particularly for this community, to hear, so that we can go, okay, part of the work that I'm doing is from my experience and from my choices. And part of the work that I'm doing is just, this is the starting point, and I need to look at my starting point for me to create transformation.
Yes, and we need to take responsibility, and we have tools now we didn't have a few years ago, and it's just astonishing that now we have all of these body-based therapies like EFT, like tapping, like EMDR, like somatic experiencing, that are so effective at working with these factors and can shift us. And they don't shift us in a generation or 100 years. They shift us very, very quickly. I did one study of epigenetics of veterans with PTSD, and they had we were measuring these little things called microRNAs, which adhere to the genome and inhibit your ability to be resilient. And we found that as they tapped, and they got 10 sessions of tapping from a certified clinical EFT practitioner, as they tapped, those little epigenetic markers, those microRNAs, were literally popping off the genome in 10 sessions. So it doesn't take 10,000 hours, doesn't take a long time. As you start tapping, as you start healing, you're becoming more resilient very, very rapidly. Now you are no longer predisposed to those same kinds of influences from the outside world. You have that inner strength to handle them. Everyone has adversity. How much strength do you have to handle the bad stuff?
And so then, as someone who is hearing this and stepping into all of this, like, how do I go, boy, this is something I need to be working on? That might feel like a really simple question, but I think oftentimes I can intellectually understand, I can recognize it in the people around me. Like, but sometimes we are notoriously bad eyewitnesses to our own experience. Like,
Yeah.
where do we start to think about, ooh, this might be something that is a struggle or something that can be strengthened inside of me?
A number of ways. One is to develop resilience before the crisis. And so we're all going to have crises in our lives. And so it could be a financial crisis, could be a marriage or family crisis, a friend, a career crisis, health crisis. And even if your life goes perfectly from day one, eventually you'll get old and die. So we're all going to have to handle some stuff in our lives. Some of us have to handle a lot of stuff in our lives. And you want to start now. You do not want to wait until you're in the middle of a crisis and then reach out for resources. Now, by all means, do reach out for resources in the middle of a crisis.
Right.
Don't wait for a crisis to start developing resilience. And the way you do that is there's a wonderful practice we have in EFT. It's an EFT manual. It's free all over the web. It's called the Personal Peace Procedure. And what you do is you go and in the version we have in the EFT manual, you pick 40 events from your life. You do not start with your childhood because you're too likely to re-traumatize yourself and get overwhelmed. You start with the recent events and less intense events, but you tap on events from your past. And you tap on more events from your past, and you tap on bigger events from your past. You find those that are too big for you to handle. You go find a practitioner, tap with a practitioner on those events. And doing that, you clear a lot of the trauma. Now, do you clear all of it? No. But do you clear enough of it to start to develop resilience? Absolutely. Now you're firing those neurons of that ability to handle stressors. And you suddenly notice after maybe 2 months, we find that in 2 months, the change is measurable psychologically. Things that used to bug you and annoy you and overwhelm you, suddenly you're just, it's like water off a duck's back. They just don't bother you anymore. Your boss says that grating, annoying thing that he is so good at saying, and you just take a deep breath and let it go. Or your child. I remember when my daughter was a teenager and she said, "Daddy, I'm going to get a tattoo." Like, ah! I took a deep, that was inside. Outside, I took a deep breath, a little bit of tapping, and I said, tell me more about that. So you're no longer reactive to the same things you were before. That's resilience. And you
And
develop in advance.
yeah, and so there's a couple of things I wanna kinda tease out of that. The first is, I love the idea of talking about, like, when we're going to clear stuff that is bugging us and things from our past, that we don't have to go to the biggest, scariest monster in the room when we're doing that particular work, and in some cases, doing that on our own and doing that first, like you said, is the dangerous way. It's an unhealthy way, it's an unsafe way for us to be doing it, and so, again, giving ourselves permission to be gentle in the process. The other thing you said was, after 2 months, we noticed this change. And I know that there are people who are listening along who went, "Oh, I don't wanna have to wait 2 months for that particular change," except for the fact, if you think back to 2 months ago, like, it was a split second. Like, it's not that big of a deal. That going like, when we look backwards on a couple of months, it's not that much time. And recognizing the fact that also this change is about all of the things that we're experiencing. Because each time I'm in a circumstance, like the example you gave of a boss who says the thing, tells the same story 18 times or whatever that is, that just grates us. Well, if it doesn't grate me, not only do I not feel emotional in that moment, I have saved all the resources I would have spent being emotional in that moment so that later in the day, when something much more significant came up, I am more well resourced to respond to that particular thing. So, not only is it good for us to have a higher baseline of the things that impact us, but we're also paying it forward in a way so that when I do get to something that is harder, when I do get to something that really is going to stretch me to be able to respond to it in a healthy, successful way, I have more present inside of me to be able to respond to that. So it's not that I'm just more resilient, I also have more in store to take after it when I go into it.
Yeah, and you need that store of resilience. There's something in medicine called allostatic load. And so if you're a teacher in a classroom with 30 kids and 10 of them have the flu, you have a strong immune system, you're doing fine. The moment the 15th kid gets the flu, the allostatic load is too great, it overwhelms your immune system, and you get the flu. And it's the same thing emotionally. We can handle a certain number of stresses, trials, insults, challenges in our lives. If there are an overwhelming number of them, we have a lot harder time handling those. So start out small, handle the things you do, and shift those things you can handle easily. That'll build your confidence in handling bigger things later on. And just to clarify about that 2 months, what I mean is that's super quick because it's 2 months and we can see these changes anatomically in the brain.
Wow.
It's not
Yeah.
like we can see them in mood, abstract things like mood. We can see them in terms of changed functionality and anatomy. Your brain is changing so quickly that anatomically it shifts within 60 days, and we can see that. In terms of your mood shifting, we can see that in minutes. I did my very first study, I did a VFT. I was traveling around promoting my book, The Genie in Your Genes. I was at medical conferences. I was doing 1 day EFT workshops with people, doctors, nurses, therapists at all of these conferences around 2005. And I was doing a tapping day with them. And between the beginning of the tapping day and the end of the tapping day, we found that their anxiety and depression levels dropped by 45%. That was the
Wow.
average of over 217 healthcare professionals, a 45% drop. So immediate mood shift is extremely rapid. Brain change shows up in about 2 months.
That's really awesome. The other thing I think that's also like when we look at like going forward and how we show up, it's not just about how we respond to the things that are hard, but our ability to make clearer, sharper, better choices as well. I'm sure, I've certainly been in a circumstance where I've tried to change my diet. Breakfast is the easiest thing in the world because I'm starting the day fully resourced. Then, as the day goes long, as I do things that are hard, as I spend energy on all of this stuff, by the time I get to the end of the day, for me to make a good choice that might be a difficult choice is harder for me because I'm diminished inside of that.
Yeah, and
Um,
look at the research on that, and there are no really hard and fast numbers, but the estimates are by researchers that we can make 7 to 12 significant decisions a day. After that, decision fatigue sets in, and we make poorer and poorer decisions. It's that resilience, it's that backlog you're talking about. We need a large reserve in order to act wisely.
So then, in addition to doing something like the personal peace procedure and just kind of chipping away at that, what are other practical things that we can do to just slowly inch our way up, creating what that emotional baseline of resilience looks like?
One really good marker for each of us, and it's highly personal, is contraction and expansion. And essentially, a cell is either growing or it's dying. And so
Mhm.
our cells grow for a while and eventually they reach the point of senescence and then they die. And so, are you moving forward expansively in your life or are you contracting? Are you shrinking?
Mm.
And that contraction is really interesting. So, somebody says a certain kind of statement and you find yourself shrinking inside. What's going on there actually is that you're starting to make more cortisol, you're starting to make more adrenaline, and you're developing what Wilhelm Reich in the 1920s called body armor. You're armoring yourself, you're armoring. And what starts to happen after people have done that for a while is they start to look armored. I'm just going to turn sideways over here so you can see what that looks like. So, men in their late 60s, 70s, like I am, they will after a while after they have become body armored and withdrawn their chests, they start to hunch over like this to compensate. They lift their heads and they walk around like this rather than like this. So that's that withdrawal from life. Notice when you are withdrawing and contracting. When is your gut clenching? When is your throat closing up? When are you feeling tension in your face, jaw, eyes, and other parts of your head, neck, shoulders? So notice your own contraction and expansion. When you feel yourself contracting, you don't even have to know why. Because sometimes, like we have a whole program teaching therapists to deal with pre and perinatal trauma, and it was pre verbal, so those clients will never know why. but you can feel it. The body keeps the score. It's held on to those insults in the form of physical feelings. So when you feel that contraction now, you don't even have to know why. It may be pre-verbal. You tap and you release and you find yourself flowing. One woman I worked with on a car crash, she'd had a car crash, and she talked about the car crash. She was sitting there in her seat. She was really stiff. Her shoulders were tense like this. Her voice and her throat was all constricted. And she talked about her car crash experience. Then we tapped. And I had to tell the whole story of the car crash again at the end. And she talked about how the car in front of her swerved unexpectedly and she tried to compensate. It didn't work. And I looked at her and I realized she's moving her body. She's fluid. She's expansive. She is flowing emotionally. She's flowing physically. She has full range of motion. Before, she was like this. What's making you go like this? That's one big clue when you find patterns that make you go like that. Just tap on the pattern. We want you to find specific events when you can, and sometimes you cannot, and you certainly cannot if the event was pre-verbal. You definitely cannot remember what happened in the womb when your parents were having a fight. But your body keeps the score, your body knows, and that's that little bit of tension that you always have in your left shoulder that you can't figure out the reason for, and you probably injured it a few times, and you've now splinting it. And so those things, notice where you're holding, where you're contracting rather than expanding. That's your clue. And then just tune into that part of your body and do some general tapping. So be preemptive. Take care of as much of this as possible. Then when you have new challenges, you'll be resilient.
And this one thing I want to underline in there that I think is super, super important, because most of us, when we learn tapping, we learn this, be as specific as possible. The more specific you are, the more successful it is. And it's really easy for us to take that and interpret it as, I must be specific to be successful. And I love the fact that you're saying there, we don't have to remember something to start, because like on a conscious or a subconscious level, there might be a part of this goes, I want to understand why this is the way that it is so I can prevent it before I do the healing. And it's almost like if I heal, I'm going to miss the opportunity to learn the lesson. And
Yeah.
we're probably going to learn the lesson. But the other is, like you're saying, is sometimes there's not a lesson. Like there's not a lesson from me where my father almost drowned when he was 13 years old. There's not a lesson for me to learn. There's not an initial sensitizing event, even though that fear gets passed to me in an epigenetic way, like you're talking about. The other thing that I love that you're as the starting point here is it's just simple. It's just notice. And I love the fact that you didn't say evaluate or score. Noticed. Like at one point, as I was a number of years ago after a back injury, as I was doing the work to get back to where I was, one of the things I did was I set an alarm, and every 3 hours the alarm went off, and I just wanted to notice my back. Like I just removed myself. Okay, just notice. And then maybe I did some evaluation. Maybe I did some tapping. Maybe I gave myself a high five because I'd been standing the right way for the last little bit and was doing a good job. And I wanted to affirm and give myself a gold star for doing a good job. But that idea of just notice, and the beautiful thing is that if it is something that is contracting and I'm noticing it and I'm tapping, I start to reverse that and I let that go. If I am feeling expansive and I start to tap, I'm taking those Technicolor dials on the old tube television and I'm turning them up, and I'm getting a chance to amplify that particular experience. And like, I love sophisticated tools, but man, this is so lovely because it's simple, it's easy, and it's easy for us to notice if we just do that particular piece of it.
Yeah, and thinking about a specific event is very useful because it
Yep.
brings you a high degree of mindfulness. But body awareness is mindfulness as well. And being conscious of your belief systems is mindfulness too. So there are many, many different ways to be mindful. It's really useful to work with events, because if we work with events, we can drill down and really figure out the specifics of the event, what we call the aspects in EFT. It's not a little piece of jargon. The aspects are all the components of the event, which often we can mine for ways in which our body encodes that as traumatic and tap on. But if you don't remember that, if all you have is a belief, if all you have is a physical sensation, just tap on that. That's as much of a gateway as anything else. And then again, you start to feel yourself shifting. I can often feel little things popping into my field of awareness gene that I can't link to any event in my life. They're just like little energy strands, and I tap on them. And just for example, I can feel all the anxiety around the election going on right now in the US. And it's a social energy strand. And actually, I've been waking up at night sometimes thinking about that and then having to release that tension. I can feel in the mass consciousness there's all this swirling energy there. And so is it mine? No, not at all. Do I need to release it? Absolutely. Otherwise it'll affect me. So I tap and I release that energy strand because I'm part of a big community, and that's this big community is having this massive social traumatic experience right now. And I certainly want to be a good citizen, but I also want to release the energetic part of that in me and not be holding on to those negative energies and compounding it by adding my little strand of negative energy into the whole.
Our friend Rick Wilkes calls that being a vibrational leader.
Yeah.
And I just love that sense of just showing up from vibrational leadership where, when I'm able to downregulate, let go, not contribute to that, not only am I making it easier for myself, but I'm modeling and I'm creating space for the people around me to maybe breathe a little easier, which gives it like just I exhale a little bit more, and all of a sudden I remember a resource that I can reach for in my own life. And it's not like I am deliberately showing up creating this cascading effect, but I am creating a cascading effect. And I don't know what that effect's going to be, but the more I am letting go of whatever my part of the whole is, or whatever part of the whole that I'm clinging onto, not only is it better for me, but it's better for the community that's around me as I'm just moving through the world as a human, because we are all in community in that particular way.
I'm thinking about those videos that we just saw of those people tapping in Democratic Republic of Congo, in Uganda, in Rwanda, other places, and that's going to produce real social change. We estimate that there are about 40 million people plus who are tapping worldwide now, and that means those societies are going to be on a different trajectory. 40 million people changing, 40 million people releasing their stress, 40 million people improving their level of happiness, 40 million people releasing both their trauma and having an effect on the communities around them is going to change the global trajectory. So we are being vibrational leaders in doing this. We think it's healing ourselves. We are often unaware of how far outside of ourselves our influence might reach.
And the other thing I think that's good to recognize inside of that, not only do we not recognize what's there, it's also the place that I have the most control. I'm sure you've gotten stuff like this where I've had someone reach out to me and they're like, how can I tap so my partner stops doing blah, blah, blah? You know, and I appreciate that particular intention. And there can be people in my life who are doing things that are harmful and dangerous and stuff like that. And I want to push back against that. But recognizing when it comes to emotional change and emotional transformation, the place that I have the most control is the work that's going from the inside out, which sometimes is the scariest work to be doing, but it's the place that we can control as we're doing that sort of stuff.
Yeah, and if you look at the research on this phenomenon called emotional contagion, and again, if I can have 10 seconds of geeking out on this, it was
Please.
a subset of data from the Framingham Heart Study, which began in the early 1950s, and they examined all the inhabitants of Framingham, Massachusetts. And they've been tracking them now for 4 generations. And the researchers have taken those data from the Framingham Heart Study. They've applied the techniques of epidemiology, how viruses and bacteria spread, and applied it to the modeling happiness in that
Hmm.
cohort of people in that study. And they find that when a person becomes happier, that it affects their next door neighbor. Their next door neighbor is about 35% more likely to be happy if you're happy. So you're
Hmm.
affecting your next door neighbor. Just that smile you're giving them, or that wave you're giving them, or that nice act you're doing for them, just that makes them increases their happiness possibility not by 1 or 2%, by 35%. And then they in turn affect their neighbor, and their neighbor's happiness goes up about 15%, and that person affects their neighbor who you don't even know, and their happiness is about 6% higher. So when we're happy, our happiness is literally emanating 3 degrees beyond us and affecting people around us.
It reminds me of some silly cliche I heard in a workshop somewhere along the way that said, "You are the average of the 5 people you spend the most time with." And recognizing that, and also we consciously and subconsciously recognize it in the inverse. When someone who's coming around us is a giant grumpopotamus, like we are immediately like, might leave the room, might disengage, might do something else, because we recognize not only is that not an enjoyable experience, but we're trying to avoid the corrosiveness of that particular experience of what's going on. And we're just doing it like, I don't teach a baby to suck its thumb. It does it because it knows it's self-soothing. I don't have to teach someone to disengage and leave when someone really grumpy shows up. Like we just do that to feel better in that particular way.
Yeah, we're taking care of ourselves, and by doing that, we're taking care of the world.
And so you have all of this amazing knowledge and information that you've learned about the brain and the experience and the tapping and all of this sort of stuff. If you could jump in a time machine and go back and talk to the 15-year-old Dawson, what is, yes, that's a horrifying thing. Just to make you realize how horrifying this was, the 15-year-old Gene had a mullet with a home perm. So it's a horror that we don't want to deal with in any particular way. But if you could go back to that particular setting and you could hand and a sense of generosity and it be accepted, what's the tool that you would want to give your teenage self based on what you now know that you would think would create positive change for you and the community around you?
One day when I really was 15, my family was at a hotel, and there was a full-length mirror. And those things were pretty rare in back then in the 1960s. And so I stood there and I looked at myself. At that time, I had very long hair. I used to carry a bag of books over my shoulder at all times. I wore bell-bottom jeans, and I looked like just a 15-year-old back in the 60s. And and as I stood there staring at myself full length, which I probably had never done before, unbidden, this thought flashed into my mind, and I stared at myself, and my self-talk was, "Those are the saddest eyes I have ever
Mm.
seen in my life." I realized I was so incredibly screwed up. I was depressed, I was anxious, I was miserable, I was suicidal. Just my life, I just basically faced each day. My mindset going into every day was dread, absolute sick dread at the thought of meeting a new day. And it had been that way for, since I was a little kid. So I didn't have a particularly propitious time at that period in my life. And what I would tell that 15-year-old who was so impacted by the events of his life is, I would, for one thing, I just say to him, it's gonna be okay. In fact, it's gonna be fabulous. You will be one of the happiest people on earth by the time you hit 50. So don't worry, and you'll have a lot of happy moments along the way too. So I'd reassure him. And I think what I would recommend he do, and this again is going below tapping, it's
Mhm.
going below meditation, it's going down to fundamental practices. I would simply tell him to be aware of his breath for a certain amount of time every day. Right now,
Mm.
I wake up in the morning and I try and take 108 conscious breaths before I do anything. So the first thing I do, my first act of meditation, is to take 108 conscious breaths. It takes about 25 minutes to do that. It doesn't take that long. But you're then in your body from the first breath. You can't control the mind. The mind is wild. The mind is full of thoughts, and all of this stuff swirls through all the time. But when you pay attention to the breath, it tends to calm the mind. So what I would have shared with him is, be aware of your breath, and also make awareness of your breath a habit. Do it on a regular basis. If possible, do it at a defined time every day. There's such power in routine, and our brains are built in a very interesting way. I mean, when we learn new stuff, it's very actively engaging our neocortex on the outside of our brain. But as we let things settle into habits, those learnings then are taken over by the basal ganglia at the bottom of the brain. So at the first, it takes a lot of conscious control, cognitive control. That's the neocortex. After a while, it's this much more ancient part of the brain, the basal ganglia. And so if you do things at the same time every day, if you just say take those 108 conscious breaths every morning when you wake up, after a while, it goes to the basal ganglia and you start to make it a habit. And you just then are in touch with your body. And so many of us live so much of our lives in our heads or ultimately being driven by our emotions. And I'm going to say some extreme statements over here, but neurologically, they're true. One is that you cannot be happy. You cannot be happy on a sustained basis unless you learn to regulate your emotions. What we see in the brains of monks and nuns with 10,000 hours of meditation practice is we see a very highly developed circuit, brain circuit that runs between the prefrontal cortex and the limbic system. They have superb emotional regulation. It doesn't mean that they are emotionally flat, they have all the same emotions, but they just dial them down when they're distressed. What that dial enables them to do, though, is not only dial down negative emotions, it enables them to dial up positive ones. And so that learning, that breath, that centering, do that often enough, it helps dramatically with emotion regulation. So if you can learn to regulate your emotions and learn that emotions come, emotions go, they actually aren't that important, and you then can start to have that foundation of a happy life.
And what I love about that is it's not requiring a huge amount of detective work. It's just it's doing the process of being still in the moment at the beginning of the day. I'm sure you've heard this from people that you work with, that sometimes they're afraid to go there because I'm going to open a fire hose of emotion. It's going to become overwhelming. And what you're talking about here is biological change that disposes us to feel better, that starts from simply paying attention and noticing our breath in a deliberate way every single day as we're setting ourselves up to walk into the world. And it's so encouraging in that. Yeah, go ahead.
And it is biological. Um,
Yeah.
I'm much more of a fan of biological techniques than of mental techniques. The mental techniques have their place and can be incredibly high leverage if you get the right
Mhm.
ones. But biological techniques that settle your biology, like, when you're upset about something, like if I'm upset about the election, I can say to myself, Dawson, it's irrational to be upset about the election. Don't be upset about the religion. But it's like talking to the dog, that part of your brain, the emotional part, the limbic system, language does not reside there. It resides in Broca's area right over here, a totally different part of the brain. That emotional part has no language. I can say to my emotional brain, don't be upset about the election over and over and over again, and I'm still getting upset about the election. So I need a biological intervention, and tapping is superb. Breathing is good. Tapping is better than breathing. Okay, so I say that because we've done one randomized controlled trial published in an American Psychological Association journal, beautifully designed study, and we compared diaphragmatic breathing to tapping, and we found that both of them had identical short-term effects working with trauma, working with traumatic memories. Both of them produced the same downslope in symptoms, but the breathers were back up again in 30 days. The tappers were not. So tapping has long-term effects, but short-term breathing has those effects as well. So you want to recruit your biology. Don't try and tell yourself to change. It's like, telling your dog not to eat the shoes. I mean, the dog doesn't understand. So your emotional brain's the dog. It doesn't understand those verbal instructions. It only understands the language of emotion.
Well, you've said my favorite phrase so far of this particular event: recruit your biology.
Recruit your
That
biology.
is that is such a lovely thought, because I'm getting it on board. I'm taking this part of me on board so it makes it easier for me to create change and transformation. Well, Dawson, thank you. Thank you so much for your support of this amazing event. Thank you for all of the amazing work that you do. I tell David Feinstein this and Peter Stapleton this all the time. You make my life so much easier, that when I'm talking to other people and I don't just get a chance to share my lived experience, I get to share these beautiful studies that you all have put together to help us to share this work in a way that makes it easier for people to try. Because once they try, they feel it, it becomes a lived experience, and it's so much easier for them to do that. So
Hmm.
thank you for your insight. Thank you for your time. Thank you for your life's work. It just really makes a difference in my life and to so many others as well.
Thank you so much. It's a joy to do it. And one of the great things about the side benefits of releasing all of those early life traumas, all of the early life stress, changing your life, is your happiness level just goes through the roof. So when I wrote my book, Bliss Brain, part of it was the fact that I just lost my home to a wildfire a few months before. I'd had a big financial crash. I'd had a big health crash. And I was just sitting there meditating every morning in absolute bliss. And I thought, this is just crazy. Why is
Right.
this? And so I wrote the book Bliss Brain to try and explain that. But we do become so much more resilient as we do these things, as we use these practices in advance, and you start to hit happiness levels that are just impossible to conceive if you haven't done it. So do this work, release all of that stuff through tapping, meditate, bring yourself these elevated places in consciousness, and you find your level of contentment, of fulfillment, of patience, of a sense of well-being goes up, not just incrementally by a few percent, but orders of magnitude higher. And so we're meant to live that way. We have circuitry in our brain that is meant to process the experience of ecstasy. And we have several, I'm writing a new book about this, it'll be out next year. We have these 4 circuits that literally will create the experience of ecstasy in our brains. Most people have them dial down because they're stressed, but release the stress, they dial way up and you hit those happiness levels. So that's the byproduct doing this, Gene. It is a joy.
Awesome. Awesome. Well, I look forward to being in the same space with you sometime soon so I can give you a big hug, friend. Thank you very much for your time.
Every blessing.
Bye-bye. If you found this interview inspiring, I would encourage you to support the Peaceful Heart Network by going to 24hoursoftapping.com/support or clicking the link in the description. And you will see on the screen right now a playlist to all of the interviews from this year's and last year's 24 Hours of Tapping. I hope you enjoyed those as well.